the heart of southern Africa lies a land of unparalleled beauty and wealth. The richness of the land could not escape the ambitious eyes of the British Empire. With an iron grip, they claimed dominion over the land, wresting it from the hands of its African population. Their insatiable hunger for resources led them to exploit its treasures, sending them across oceans to fuel the industrial might of the distant motherland in Europe. The European invaders took over the land and named it Southern Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. Responsible for overseeing the conquest, Rhodes was infamous for his racist views towards the African continent and its people. Here are his words on the matter. "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." In 1965, at the dawn of the decolonization of African countries, fearing the return of black majority rule, Ian Smith, the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, declared independence from Britain. After the declaration, Ian Smith renamed the land simply as Rhodesia. This move was made to maintain white minority control in the face of increasing pressure from the African people to reclaim their land. Rhodesia experienced a prolonged and violent struggle for the liberation of the land from the white minority rulers. At the forefront of this struggle were the African liberation movements known as ZANU and ZAPU, led by Robert Mugabe, the leader of the largest and most secretive African guerrilla army operating against the white minority Rhodesian government. Hated by the West, Mugabe was labeled a terrorist and branded as the man who massacred his own people.
Once upon a time, Prime Minister, you said you would never see black rule in this country in your lifetime. Do you still stand by that?
Yes, I believe that it was a fair comment, and I think that if we ever got to a stage of having black rule, then I think our policy would have failed.
In the early 1970s, during the Rhodesian Bush War, ZANU military commander Josiah Tongogara went to China to receive guerrilla warfare training and to establish connections with other liberation movements and communist countries supporting the struggle against the white minority rule in Rhodesia. This training in China contributed to Tongogara's military skills and leadership abilities. The Soviet Union, along with other communist bloc countries, also provided military support to the liberation movements. The Soviet Union supplied all the weapons and ammunition the military wings of ZANU and ZAPU desperately needed to fight for their freedom. The white monopoly over the lands also gave whites a monopoly over the Rhodesian political system, despite the fact that the country was overwhelmingly black. By 1976, the black population was 6 million, while the white population was only 250,000. Of the 6 million blacks, only 9,000 had the right to vote. This allowed white voters to elect 50 members of Rhodesian parliament, whereas blacks only elected 16. International isolation and guerrilla warfare, led by black nationalists, resulted in negotiations in 1979 at the Lancaster House Conference in London. The agreement laid the groundwork for the transition to majority rule, establishing a ceasefire, a new constitution, and provisions for democratic elections. The Lancaster House Agreement led to elections in February 1980, where Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF Patriotic Front won a decisive victory. Following the election, on April 18, 1980, Rhodesia officially became the independent Republic of Zimbabwe. At last, the land was freed. The Lancaster House Agreement, while successful in setting the stage for Zimbabwe's independence, saw violations and treacherous actions from the British government. The new freedom of Zimbabwe was short-lived. The negotiated agreements between the British government, Ian Smith, and the leaders of the Patriotic Front guerrilla movements led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo turned out to be a sham. Owning the lands and all the valuable resources that came with it made the Europeans incredibly wealthy. Nothing seems to have changed. In fact, the majority of the black population has become wage laborers working for white masters who treat them like animals.
He is guilty of stealing. A leader of this whole group here.
According to
like him.
According to the police.
Have they been tried?
No, they haven't been tried yet. I don't think so. I don't know. Ask them, George. Have you been tried yet?
No.
You haven't been tried yet. When's your case coming up?
No, I was found unguilty.
You have been tried.
You did only suspect me.
Have you been tried yet?
No.
You haven't been tried.
I'm
The
out
police
of
can't even charge him because there is no
Well,
evidence.
the police took him away.
Yes,
Asked him if
there's
he'd
no-
been charged, and he was charged.
If you call the police and say, take him away, he has stolen, they will take him away.
Instead of simply returning the stolen lands back to the African people, the Lancaster House Agreement introduced a market-based system known as willing buyer, willing seller, where the government of the newly named Zimbabwe would have to buy the stolen lands from the European invaders, white farmers, many of whom were descendants of British settlers, in British pounds or US dollars. It gets much worse. The value of the land was determined by the white settlers. By 1998, 95% of the Zimbabwean economy was controlled by the Europeans and Americans. How could they afford to buy back their land? Over time, the Zimbabwean government under Robert Mugabe grew frustrated with the pace of the land reforms. The African war veterans who risked their lives to gain independence started to occupy the stolen lands, including white-owned illegal farms. Robert Mugabe's government had no choice but to accept the will of the people. The expropriation of the farmlands without compensation by the Zimbabwean government was to rectify colonial injustices in land ownership. The move is to redistribute resources to the rightful black owners. The abrupt and chaotic nature of the expropriation of land from white commercial farmers to black Zimbabweans sparked anger in the West. The United States, together with the European Union, Canada, and Australia, imposed some of the most severe and unfair sanctions, comparable to those imposed on Iraq, Cuba, and North Korea. In 2002, the EU first imposed a travel ban on key government officials, and many Zimbabwean assets were seized. The sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by Western countries were officially justified by citing human rights abuses and the undermining of democracy. They named it targeted or restrictive measures on Zimbabwe. It sounds fancy but deadly in reality. In 2003, President George W. Bush issued an executive order which experts believe to be a declaration of war on Zimbabwe by the US government. The US declared Zimbabwe to be an extraordinary threat to the United States government, and a national emergency was declared. Under this declaration, there were only two options: massive economic sanctions or military invasion of Zimbabwe. Under the targeted sanctions program, no US or foreign companies are allowed to deal with the Zimbabwean government. Under the US ZIDERA Act, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, the Zimbabwean government was given an ultimatum to respect human rights, stop aiding the Congolese in their fight for freedom, and return the rich farmlands to the British and European settlers. If none of these demands were met, the US would halt all Zimbabwean dealings with the IMF and the World Bank, and all government debt would have to be paid in full. The US controls all financial institutions, so what the US commands goes. In 2007, white farmers went to a special regional court called the SADC Tribunal, a Western-controlled court, to demand compensation and the return of their farmland. The court ruled in their favor, and the Zimbabwean government was ordered to pay a total of $39 billion to the European farmers. The government agreed to pay $53 million so they would leave the black people alone. The Industrial Development Corporation of Zimbabwe, IDCZ, the state-owned enterprise responsible for investing, promoting, and facilitating industrial development in Zimbabwe, was completely blacklisted, and all its foreign funds were frozen. The US unilateral sanctions prevented money from flowing into Zimbabwe. Foreign banks were prohibited from dealing with Zimbabwean banks. Banks that ignored the sanctions were heavily fined, up to $18 million. CBZ, an important financial institution based in Zimbabwe, was fined $385 million. The fear of US sanctions isolated Zimbabwe. The country became unable to develop because it was prevented from accessing credit and trading in the international market. The US prevented Zimbabwe from importing new technology, fertilizers, medicine, and spare parts, rendering its health, transportation, water, and other critical infrastructure obsolete. The Great Zimbabwe has collapsed. What happened next was one of the greatest Western human rights violations of all time. The US and its European allies have created a humanitarian disaster, with over half of the population of Zimbabwe going hungry. The inability of the country to import spare parts to clean its own water has created outbreaks of diseases such as cholera. The shortages of medicines have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of the black population. The 2002 drought exacerbated the crisis, reducing agricultural productivity and worsening food insecurity, coinciding with the peak of the land reform program.
Children suffer from malnutrition, hunger, and diseases, compounded now by the deadly HIV/AIDS pandemic. We don't...
The Western media still demonize Zimbabwe as a country that is racist towards Europeans for having expropriated the stolen lands. They mock Zimbabwe for collapsing, claiming it lacks the skills to farm its own land. The Zimbabwean dollar's collapse, marked by hyperinflation in the late 2000s, saw its value plummet to the point where trillion-dollar notes became worthless. Western media mocked the currency's collapse and continues to insist on mismanagement, depicting it as a symbol of failed state policies and corruption, completely omitting any mention of the US and European sanctions designed specifically to collapse the nation's economy. In reality, the sanctions served as a deterrent to Zimbabwe's southern neighbor, South Africa. This is what will happen to you if you dare to take your land back. If land reform was so destructive, why would the West need economic sanctions at all? The land reform in Zimbabwe was massively successful, just as it was in Asia when it was implemented. In the blink of despair and collapse, China emerged as the hope of the Zimbabwean people, supporting the nation in circumventing US sanctions. By providing financial aid, investment, and diplomatic backing, China helped mitigate the economic impact of these sanctions. Chinese secret investments in Zimbabwe's infrastructure, mining, and agriculture have been crucial in preventing the total collapse of the economy. China extended loans and credit lines, enabling Zimbabwe to access essential funds and resources otherwise restricted by Western financial systems. 23 years of sanctions brought Zimbabwe to its knees, but China's support has finally paid off. For the first time in history, a country has forced the US to lift executive order sanctions without the country being destroyed in a war. This is historic. In 2024, 99% of the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe have been lifted. The US was forced by human rights activists and China to remove Zimbabwe from its national security threat list. There have been discussions and negotiations between Zimbabwean officials and Chinese authorities regarding potential cooperation and participation in BRI projects. The BRI is a massive infrastructure and economic development initiative led by China, aimed at enhancing connectivity and cooperation between countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure projects, trade, and investment. Zimbabwe has rolled out a new gold-backed currency called the ZiG, or Zimbabwe Gold, in an effort to mitigate the currency instability and hyperinflation that has plagued the country for decades. Zimbabwe has survived and will recover. Here is what you need to know. If the economic sanctions did not work, the USA would have militarily invaded Zimbabwe. Let us know in the comments section if you think Zimbabweans were actually lucky.
Zimbabwe, Nagala to show Zimbabwe, Nagala to show Zimbabwe, Nagala to show Zimbabwe, Nagala to show.